Hi everyone, I'm Anya Parampil and you're watching Red Lines. The Chinese government has announced new restrictions on plastic products as part of an effort to reduce pollution. The measures include an outright ban on the import of plastic waste. China will also prohibit the use of non-biodegradable plastic in major cities by the end of 2020, with the goal of expanding that ban to the entire nation by the end of 2025. While China is often the focus of mainstream media in the West, little is actually understood about the country. And yet, liberal and conservative politicians almost uniformly denounce China as the #1 threat to Western hegemonic influence worldwide. But what is China really like? Danny Haiphong, a contributing editor to the Black Agenda report, recently had the opportunity to travel throughout the country, including to the western province of Xinjiang, where Western media, human rights groups, and politicians claim China is currently housing millions of Muslims in concentration camps. He published an article about his trip at the Black Agenda report titled, "My Trip to China Exposed the Shameful Lies Peddled by the American Empire." He joined Red Lines to discuss his findings. Danny Haiphong, contributing editor to the Black Agenda report, thanks a lot for making time to speak with me this afternoon about your 2-week trip to China. I wanted to start just by asking, what was the purpose of this trip? And what was one misconception that maybe even you had about the country before going that was dispelled by your time there?
So the purpose of the trip, and thank you for having me on, Anya. I love your show. We went on this trip, a group of 20, with the China-U.S. Solidarity Network, led by an individual named Li Suhin, who travels to and from China a lot, lives partly in China, is a sweatshop worker in Los Angeles. And he wanted to bring people from the United States on a trip. He's done this many times before to show people in the United States what the real China is like. And through a combination of tourism, because it's really hard to get people from the United States to go to China without tourism, but also through some goodwill solidarity meetings. We met with the Beijing Friendship Association. A few friends of mine were able to get a meeting with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And we ended up traveling from Beijing in the northeast all the way to the west to Urumqi, which is considered the capital of Xinjiang province. And in our travels over the course of 2 full weeks, we were really able to get a good picture of what China is like. And one of the big misconceptions that even I had was that the capitalist market had in fact penetrated a lot more deeply than I actually saw in China. It's pretty clear, even just walking the streets, that the central government in China is in command and really does plan around the goals of the Communist Party in order to raise the standard of living of the people and use development, whether it's capitalist development, socialist development through state-owned enterprises, in order to do that. And you can just see through the infrastructure that the biggest investment that China makes is in infrastructure. So it is really difficult to go to any city like Beijing or Xi'an or Urumqi and see anything that's more than 20, 30 years old, that there has been a lot of investment, not only in housing, but also in transportation and in electric cars, in environmental protections, that these are the things that the Chinese Communist Party and the central government as a whole have been mostly invested in. So I was surprised really to see how much China has evolved, that every time we would go somewhere, Li Suhin would point out that many of the things we were seeing are no more than 30 years old, if that. So that was really interesting to see just how a planned economy really does work in the interests of people.
Yeah, talking about looking at infrastructure that's not quite 20 or 30 years old is something that I think many of us in the United States would like to get used to, because instead we just have things that are falling apart, bridges and roads that you can barely travel on. You write in a column at the Black Agenda Report about how, quote, there is a broad consensus between the American ruling class and the so-called American left about China. The consensus position is that China is a tyrannical, oppressive, and politically backward dictatorship. Why do you think there exists this view of China, even among so-called leftists in the US?
It's a really a long historical trend that begins with U.S. imperialism's policy toward the East, toward Asia and China specifically, seeing it as an open door, seeing it as a semi-colony from which it could exert its interests and its dominance in the Asia Pacific. And this came with just a racist and imperialist ideology, which presumed that people in that region were a danger to the sanctity of the American people, and mainly white Americans. So there's a racial component to the hatred towards China, but the racial component is always backed up by an economic component. The principal economic interest for the United States is to contain China because China's economic system, its command economy, its planned economy, is on the rise and is quickly overtaking the United States in purchasing power parity. It already has in GDP. China grows at a clip of 6% or more every year. Wages are growing in China at a clip of 6 to 10% every year. So we're seeing a real shift in the global economic order from the unipolar capitalist system of domination, which the United States promotes, to China's market socialist economy that is producing real results and is gaining the attention of nations around the world who really want to engage with China and build infrastructure, build a growing economy themselves. And that is one of the biggest threats that the United States sees. The National Security Strategy document under the Trump administration names China, along with Russia, as the big power threats to U.S. hegemony. And so all of the negative views that people in the United States have of China revolve around these interests. And the American left, unfortunately, has taken a really dogmatic position, almost in the main, painting China as some sort of capitalist hellscape. Well, if anyone,
Yeah,
yeah,
that's one of the points that I hear the most among people who describe themselves as leftists. They say China let itself become capitalist. China is capitalist. It's one capitalist country fighting the United States, another capitalist country. So you already said you didn't see that level of capitalist takeover, but did you see that China is this tyrannical, oppressive, and politically backward dictatorship, as you write? Do you think that you saw any evidence of that? Were you feeling as though there was a strong state presence or police presence when you were traveling throughout China?
So, I see it as everything in contradictions. And so what I saw in China was a country where the vast majority of people, if not 90+% of the people that we spoke to, have very much faith and loyalty to the central government and see the central government in China as a force for good, a real force for good, unlike the United States, which posits itself as a force for good, but most people in the United States don't think that the U.S. government does anything good. So in China, what you see is a people that sees its government as working in the interests of them. And then you also see a situation where China is under real attack. And we saw this especially in Urumqi, where you can see people dancing in the streets. There are mosques almost on every street corner. However, there is a bigger security presence, especially in Urumqi, because of some real threats that most people in the United States have no understanding of. They don't understand that the Xinjiang province in China shares borders with Afghanistan, with Kazakhstan, with a region which has been beset and laid backward by U.S. imperialism through the way of jihadist terrorism. This is something that, like, Max Blumenthal writes a lot about. And this has affected China a lot because there is a group called the East Turkestan Islamic Movement, which from 1990 to 2016, 15-ish, had committed dozens of attacks inside of China, killing hundreds upon hundreds of people. And so there is a stronger security presence, especially in Xinjiang. And there is a security presence in China, mainly to protect the interests of the central government, the planned economy, and most of it is seen as something that's necessary. Like in the United States, where a lot of people are bamboozled into thinking that their surveillance apparatus is working for them, that they have nothing to hide. In China, most people think of the security apparatus as something that is necessary to protecting the interests of China and the Chinese nation. And that's a huge message you see everywhere. There's a lot of nationalism in China. There's a lot of pride in the country that's based on real, tangible things like a rapid increase in the standard of living and like the need to defend a revolution which has been under attack since 1949 by outside powers like the United States.
People in the United States are also so heavily propagandized that even when they hear someone like you speaking, they'll say, oh, well, you were in China on a government-controlled trip or you didn't have any access to real people. I know, for example, when I traveled to places like Venezuela or Syria that are under imperialist attack, people have a hard time grasping that it's possible for someone like you or me to visit these places and actually get a real idea of what's going on. So what do you say to those viewers at home who will immediately respond to your points by saying that you didn't actually get to see China?
Well, I would say that very few people from the United States actually go to China. Most of the tourism is internal, which came as a big surprise to me as well. And so I think the biggest lesson here is that, our trip was completely outside of the formal structure in China. We didn't go through the CPC or the central government or the central committee. We didn't do any of that. We went as a group that was almost like a tourist group, and we spent 2 weeks in China speaking to folks on the ground, getting a good picture of what ordinary people are experiencing there. And so, I think a big problem is that most people in the United States, especially leftists who claim to be anti-imperialist or anti-war, yet condemn China for everything they think they know, they don't do the research. And so I would say not only study the sources that you think are correct, and most of the time these sources are, Human Rights Watch or whatever, claiming they know what's going on in Xinjiang, but also go. And you can go. It's not impossible to go to China. It's actually a country that welcomes tourists. It's a country that wants deeper relations with Americans and other peoples across the world. They host students from African countries like Sierra Leone, hundreds of students who are educated there every year. China is the leader, really, in a new kind of globalization, one that's not connected to the US's version of it, which is all about ensuring that super profits come to the United States, come to the European world at the expense of countries all around the world, but is based on mutual cooperation. And when we met with folks, for example, at the Beijing Friendship Association, this is what they stressed, that they want deeper relationships with the United States, with the people of the United States, but they were very clear too. They know that the U.S. government, they know that the U.S. military apparatus, and that the U.S.'s dominant economic system is not so much interested in that. It's really interested in trying to overthrow the Chinese government. And that is something I think leftists here in the United States need to focus on more so than criticizing or condemning what they think they know about China without doing sufficient research.
Why is it our duty to sit and criticize China when we haven't really achieved something as a movement yet here in the United States is one question I have. You had the opportunity, as you mentioned, to visit Xinjiang, the autonomous Uyghur region of China. U.S. mainstream media and politicians are constantly alleging that China is housing millions of Muslims in concentration camps in this region. Did you see any evidence of that? And did you have the chance to speak with people about what's truly going on there?
So in Inamuchi, it is a tense situation. That's the city we were based in. We didn't get as much time as we wanted there. However, it is clear by walking the city, which ultimately is rivaling Beijing in terms of its level of development, um, was there were no concentration camps there in the city, and it was pretty clear that most people in China that we spoke to thought that this was a preposterous allegation, that nothing of the sort could really ever exist in China, because China does pride itself in being a multi-ethnic society. And that part of the reason why Eramuchi, for example, is so rapidly developing economically, socially, is because there is this commitment to understanding what the Chinese Communist Party, what the Chinese society as a whole needs to do to balance. That's a big word we heard a lot, was balancing the level of development across what many people in China see not as a country, but as a civilization, as a society that actually contains many nations within a nation, and that there is this recognition that there was a dire level of poverty. There was a lot of attractions to extremist ideology that existed in Xinjiang, but over the last decade or so, there has been so much work being done in terms of raising the standard of living of the people there, and that was really clear in Itamuchi, where um, we were expecting to see a much more impoverished city. We didn't see any homelessness there. We also saw, contrary to what many people think, we saw police protecting mosques, not surveilling people who were practicing in the mosque, but mosques tended to be sites where these extremist groups like ETIM would target the city. And so there were actually police protecting mosques, not patting people down who were trying to practice their faith, but actually protecting them from people who would go in and create havoc. So it's a really interesting thing to see, because I think what many people in the West, in the United States, don't understand is that China is, even though it is a rising power, it is still a nation that is under the threat of imperialism and has taken sufficient measures to ensure that it can protect its territorial and national integrity. And so that was really clear, especially in the way that people in China talk about politics, that that's the first thing that people are really striving for, is to protect the integrity of the revolution, which is embodied in the nation, in the central government, and in the planned economy.
A lot of times people will say, even if they don't believe that Muslims are in concentration camps in China, that the Chinese government does repress Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities. Did you see that? You seem to be saying that a multi-ethnic nation is encouraged, or a civilization is encouraged. But did you see any evidence of that, just for people who make those claims?
No, there was no evidence of that. Eramuchi is really the center of Xinjiang province. It's really where much of what is claimed to be the so-called rebellion of the Uyghurs was happening. And it is clear that because people's standard of living has been raised there so much, that there is a sense of national pride there that is really all about maintaining cultural integrity, but also at the same time understanding is uh, what is bigger than that, even that there is a bigger relationship that people in China, regardless of their ethnicity, have to the revolution and to the country. So I didn't see any evidence. I saw people freely dancing in the streets. One interesting thing that I found too was that everything is translated in Uyghur and Mandarin all over the city. That there are so many just little things that you see that really do counter the narrative that somehow China is oppressing a million Muslims in that region. There were many Uyghur business owners, many Uyghur people in Urumqi who were very prominent people and were very proud of what has happened there over the last several years. And it's a testament to how China has countered the influx of extremists into their country from the outside, by eradicating the conditions that make people vulnerable to wanting to take up arms for their mere survival. And I think that is a huge thing that people in the United States can really learn from. Because whether it is the mass shootings that happen in the United States, or whether it's the U.S. invading Iraq,
Mm-hmm.
or other countries and creating the conditions for terrorism to
Mm-hmm.
flourish, China is doing the exact opposite. And we have to really study that and understand that China has a lot that people in the United States could learn from this,
Right.
whatever contradictions um, China is dealing with, because it is not a perfect society. It doesn't, no one in China claims that it's perfect. There are plenty of contradictions that China itself is figuring out through trial and error a lot of the time.
Even when we talk about violence in US cities, that's something which should be addressed as an economic issue, right? I mean, we talk about cities like Chicago having extreme rates of gun violence, but US politicians hardly ever connect that problem to real economic conditions and how just an investment in people's lives could get rid of that. You mentioned in your article at the Black Agenda Report that the Uyghur independence movement is designed partially to throw a wrench in China's One Belt, One Road initiative. What can you tell us about this project and how it relates to what's happening in Xinjiang?
Yes, it's very related. The Belt and Road Initiative, another aspect of China that deserves so much attention, I think, from the left. I believe that this project is really the future of global political economy, actually, in the next several decades. And China began this initiative under Xi Jinping in 2013 and proposed a worldwide trade route independent of Western and U.S. finance. And so the Belt stands for the maritime route that it plans to develop with other countries through the Asia Pacific and into Africa and Europe, but also the road, which is the trade route through land, which seeks to build infrastructure, railways, and other modes of advanced technical transportation in order to develop mutual cooperative ties with countries around the world. This project is massive. It's a multi-trillion-dollar investment that China is mostly using through state-owned as well as state-controlled private subsidiaries in order to develop this independent economic order, a globalization that wants to repeat what the old Silk Road did, which was a lot of mutual exchanges of economic activity. Cultural activity is a huge thing too. It's not just all economics. It's not just about making money, but it's about learning from each other, culture to culture, nation to nation, and building ties that will sustain development, even development among nations in this region, which have been historically underdeveloped by the oppressive and exploitative foreign system of colonialism and imperialism. So this is a huge deal. And when we went to the Beijing Friendship Association, they have a lot of Belt and Road meetings there, and they told us that this is China's foreign policy at this point. It is really about developing and sharing advanced technology, sharing the ways in which China has been able to eradicate poverty in its country, and sharing that with the world. And doing so on the basis not of unipolar dominance, not based upon how much China will get out of it, but how much both parties and all parties will get out of sharing knowledge, sharing economic lessons, sharing technical progress. That's really what the Belt and Road is all about, and it already has, I think, almost over 126 countries that have signed on across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And that really, it's the United States that's the biggest resistor to this trend, trying to wrestle away countries like India and Japan and others from engaging in this sort of activity and undermining what the U.S. sees as maybe the largest threat to the dominance of finance capital around the world. Because China, one big thing that I didn't even know about China was that it's all the financial levers in China are controlled by the state. So even if there is private commercial activity that happens within the financial sector, it's ultimately the central government that controls what happens in the finance sector in China. And so the investments that happen around the world, the investments that happen here, has to go through the central government. And so um, by spreading that model around the world, by spreading the idea that nations can control their own economic activity and their own destinies, that's a huge threat to the future of U.S. imperialism.
And as China's westernmost province, Xinjiang would be a vital piece of the One Belt, One Road initiative, which might explain partially why there's this effort to separate it from the rest of the country. What was the reaction of average Chinese people to your group of delegates from the United States? How have they been impacted by policies such as Trump's trade war, and what do they say about relations between our two countries?
Well, there are a mix of responses because we met a people of a variety of political affiliations. There, liberal is considered ultra right and rightist. That what's interesting is that we ourselves as a delegation was very politically diverse, and we had some people on the right wing on our trip. And what was interesting was that in China, what is considered the right wing in the United States has absolutely no political influence whatsoever. There might be individuals who hold these ideologies, but they have no access to state power. Actually, when we spoke to a professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, she said to us, Donald Trump would never be able to get the lowest ranking civil servant position in China because not only of his politics, but also because he hasn't served anyone. And so service to the people is a huge priority, and it's a huge deal in China. And you can't just become an official in China without putting in service to the people, whether that's spending a year in the countryside or spending a year or more providing a direct service to the people. And so when we talk to folks, Donald Trump in Washington is seen as almost a joke in a lot of ways, almost a very dangerous joke to them because their reaction to the trade war, it was mostly, well, we're going to figure things out. We know how to handle things. We've been dealing with foreign intervention for a long time, but there is a strong desire for and hope for the American people to really change the balance of power in the United States in favor of China. And that was a big hope that things would change, but they're not holding their breath. They know that they're in for the long haul. And most of the people we talked to understood that, there may not be a change in U.S. foreign policy toward China for a very long time. And so that was motivating in a sense for me and for a few others on the trip to step up our work and engaging in solidarity work with China because it tends to get left out. That's something I learned in
People
terms
are
of,
afraid of it.
Yeah, yeah, and because of all the successes, and that's one thing, I think there's a lot of cynicism in the United States, so people see successes in China as something cynical, as part of some sort of replacement of power, so to speak. But I think it's a miscalculation to believe that China is somehow replacing the United States or European imperialism in an attempt to dominate the world order. Really, China's biggest achievement over the last 30 years is reducing poverty, and that was clear in China, and that is everywhere. One of the biggest and probably the most hopeful things that I saw was that all over the country, the posters and the propaganda, the advertisements that you see are mostly political, and it's mostly about the anti-poverty initiative. It's mostly about the core socialist values, and it's mostly about the principles that Xi Jinping has put forward as the leading ideology of the party at this time. And so that was really encouraging to see. In the United States, when we walked through any business district, any urban center, we mostly get corporate advertisements. That's what we get. And in China, it's mostly a political message that
Right.
they're proud of their achievements and they're going to promote them. And I don't see that as indoctrination at all. I see that as just a really sensible thing to do if you're going to defend the integrity of a revolution, as well as just the independence of a nation that has a centuries-long history with dealing with being subservient to imperialism.
I wish our government could go around and brag about poverty reduction, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, the opposite is true in the United States, and we see just a rise in the struggle of the working class here and the destitution they're faced with. And that's exactly what I wanted to ask you about. We've already started to touch on regarding China, what you learned about the successes of its economic model and also what it still is struggling to address.
Yes. I mean, the biggest lesson, again, yeah, it's definitely the anti-poverty initiative. That is what I think people in the United States should really take away from the Chinese Revolution in the so-called opening up and reform period, is that even though there has been an entrance of market forces, of capitalist forces, that there have been contradictions that come out of that. Most people in China are very aware of income inequality. They're very aware that market forces tend to want to expand themselves. And so there is an awareness that as market forces continue to deepen, that there will need to be even further and tighter controls to ensure that development is in the interest of the people. But I think that what I really saw, especially through just the vast differences in, for example, the transportation system between New York City and Beijing, or whether we're talking about China's real deep commitment to environmental sustainability and progress. Um, it's just incredible to see how China has taken industrialization, taken socialist modernization, as well as market forces, and almost has done a complete reorientation in how it looks at development. So, for the last 20 or 30 years, the expansion of market forces has led to um, poverty reduction, has led to a higher standard of living, but it's had a cost on the environment. Now, the central government is heavily invested in renewable energy. It's the biggest producer of renewable energy around the world. The streets of Beijing are very quiet because of just the amount of electric cars that you find in Beijing and in Xi'an and all the cities in China, that almost every street lamp you see is solar powered. You see just windmill farms everywhere. We visited a solar farm that was over 100 miles long. I mean, you can really see the commitment to environmental sustainability happening in China to a degree that is only possible under a socialist society. As we know in the United States, where not only does the US spend trillions in the war machine, which is the biggest polluter in the world, but also it subsidizes fossil fuel corporations to the tune of over almost $500 billion, over $500 billion. So I think that that was the biggest lesson in terms of what China is doing well, in terms of what China still needs to tackle. It's really, we heard a lot about localization and the continued need to still curb the gap between the countryside and the cities. That the countryside still lags behind in economic development, that even though people own the land, there's no private land ownership in China, which will probably baffle a lot of people in the United States, where private land ownership is the mode of all ownership in the US. But in China, there's no private land ownership. However, conditions for still half the country, which is considered the peasantry still, they lag behind in their economic condition. It's not that they're suffering from hunger or malnutrition or any of that. It's just that their standard of living could be higher, and that's the big focus right now. Because there was a lot of focus on the West, like in Xinjiang province, which is still ongoing. A
Mm-hmm.
lot of focus on central China. Now it's about figuring out how to take all of that urban development and repeat the lessons in very local situations that happen across the countryside, because you can't repeat the same thing as you did in cities. And so that's the big debate right now in China, is how to raise the standard of living up to the cities and the countryside while being and taking care of the very local conditions that exist in the countryside. It's a very difficult question that I don't think they figured out yet, but they're going to try through trial and error, through investments in that part of the country. But the biggest lesson of that is, wow, I wish in the United States we had a social system, an economic system, a political system where we could really figure out how to address really difficult problems like the condition of Black people in the United States as a particular state of, of a particular problem that needs to be addressed. Or we have people like Elizabeth Warren who lie about indigenous identity, but yet there's no conversation about the condition of indigenous people in the United States. I think in China, there are real conversations about, well, how do we make sure that all ethnic groups in China have the same standard of living? How do we make sure that peasants have the same living conditions as workers in the city? That's something that I think we can really learn a lot from. How do we get to that point where we can have these really particular conversations about deep problems that exist in our own society?
Well, finally, you recently published a book alongside Professor Robert Sirvent of the University of California, Fullerton, titled American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror. We know that now the U.S. national security state views China as the number one threat, and there is even a fear that the United States will push to a war with China as its force as an economic example in the world becomes stronger. How does your thesis in this book relate to your trip to China?
There's a lot to relate to in between the book and my trip. You know, American exceptionalism as an ideology, as we write, is a ruling class ideology that's all about ensuring a national consensus about the particular mode of economic and political development that the United States espouses, which is an imperialist model based on the domination of one class over all others. And it's a mode of development based upon racism and white supremacy. And it's based on the idea that the United States is a force for good in the world, despite the fact that there are so many facts and so much evidence to the contrary. But the evidence is not really the question here. The question is power. And so in China, what we see is a similar ideology. Actually, I could call it Chinese exceptionalism, that there is this idea of a Chinese dream, similar to the American dream. However, the Chinese dream is based on a political and economic system that works for people, that is geared towards ensuring that workers, peasants, and all sectors of Chinese society have a decent standard of living. While in the United States, American exceptionalism is based on the idea that the U.S. is already a force for good, when on the contrary, it is not only super exploiting workers around the world and causing military based havoc and economic catastrophes around the globe, as well as at home through police terrorism, through economic depravity and austerity and privatization. But at the same time, this ideology is justifying all of that. And so what I learned was that there is a way to, that China has its own particular situation where it was a semi-colony, where it was under the thumb of Europe, Japan, the United States at a certain point in its history, and that its notion of exceptionalism and nationalism is based on real solidarity and independence, while the United States is an empire. It is the motherland of capitalism and racism. And so we can't mimic what China has done in that sense. What we have to do is figure out a new ideology, a new way of thinking about people around the world, about workers in the United States, and all of the contradictions that exist here, and forge new ties of solidarity and relationships with each other that can produce a society that aspires to the same principles as what China is doing, but in our own context. We need to think about, how do we get to a social system, dare I say a socialist system, that takes into account the needs of all people and also addresses the particular problems and peoples who have a particular history, like Black America, Indigenous America, and be able to integrate those specific issues into our own plan. And so that's what I learned in China, was that we can't import what China has done here, but we can learn lessons based on the principles that China has employed to combat the real villainous and just deceptive hold that American exceptionalism and the ideological and economic apparatus that the United States governs over has, all the problems that that has caused. And I think we can learn a lot from countries that have been able to successfully hold off the exploitative and parasitic grip of the system that we're dealing with right here, right now, which, we see just how much disillusionment there is here in this country with the election and just our day-to-day interactions on the streets with folks here, the misery, the homelessness, the mass incarceration regime, all of this American exceptionalism justifies. While in China, the Chinese dream justifies a different set of conditions. It justifies policies that eradicate poverty and policies that set up relationships with other countries that both benefit the country, the partner, as well as the host. So that, I think, is what I've learned and what the parallels between the book and my trip speak to.
At the end of the day, we're speaking about a difference in a country which is controlled or serves the interests of private capital and industry, as opposed to one which actually puts the people at the center of its development. Maybe it still has places where they need to improve, but it's a completely different system from what we're dealing with in the United States. I encourage viewers to follow your writings at the Black Agenda Report. And where can they find you on Twitter?
Sure. So my Twitter handle is at Spirit of HO, at Spirit of Ho. So you can find me there. You can find me on Facebook just through my name, Danny Haiphong. And yeah, definitely follow me on Black Agenda Report every week.
Yeah, and you can again get the book, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror. I encourage viewers to do that as well. So Danny Haiphong, thank you so much again for that fascinating breakdown of your trip to China.
Thank you so much for having me, Anya.